Hello, 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 hello. Welcome to Storytime Classics Live, presented by Southwest Shakespeare. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. My name is Amy. I am reading for you today. For the next hour, we will be excitedly into The Moors of Jamaica Inn. Daphne du Maurier. This is the second book we have read by her. If you have not listened to or watched Rebecca, that was our first foray into her world. It was a fantastic, amazing book. This book is proving to be just as wonderful, a little actually faster paced than Rebecca was. I'm actually more in fear of people's lives because she's killing off a lot of people in this book. Didn't do that so much in Rebecca. As always, hello, Ms. James. Welcome. I'm sorry that your what day is it? Your Thursday is not amazing, but I applaud you for recognizing that Mary's is definitely worse. I would say as long as we're not stuck in the moors being chased by our fairly insane and unstable uncle, it's probably a good day. So let's see. We are going to jump right into it. I would say we probably only have 2 more days of reading. That would be my thought. We have 70 pages left, 70 pages. So let's see. We are at the height of the tension. So I felt bad that we had to end it last time, but what are you going to do? So she has just come. So she saw Mrs. Bassett and took the trap to Jamaica Inn to see if anyone is there and if Mr. Bassett has taken anyone down, if they got it. So Mary has just taken a gun, left Richards with a horse, like real hero, and said, I'll be back. I got to do this myself. And Richard said, okay, and waited. So we're at the top of page 277. For my part, I believe my uncle to have gone. She hoped now that he had, and by driving into Devon made an end to the whole business. The country would be rid of him in the cheapest possible way. He might, even as he had said, start life again, or, more likely still, dig himself in somewhere 500 miles from Cornwall and drink himself to death. She had no interest now in his capture. She wanted it finished and thrust aside. She wanted, above all, to lead her own life and forget him, and to put the world between her and Jamaica Inn. Revenge was an empty thing. To see him bound and helpless, surrounded by the squire and his men, would be of little satisfaction. She had spoken to Richard with confidence, but for all that she dreaded an encounter with her uncle, armed as she was. And the thought of coming upon him suddenly in the passage of the inn, with his hands ready to strike and his bloodshot eyes staring down upon her, made her pause in her stride before the yard and glance back to the dark shadow in the ditch that was Richard and the trap. Then she leveled her pistol, her finger upon the trigger, and looked round the corner of the stone wall to the yard. It was empty. The stable door was shut. The inn was as dark as silent as when she had left it nearly 7 hours before, and the windows and the doors were barred. She looked up to her window, and the pane of glass gaped empty and wide, unchanged since she had climbed in from that afternoon. There were no wheel marks on the yard, no preparations for departure. She crept along to the stable and laid her ear against the door. She waited a moment, and then she heard the pony move restlessly in his stall. She heard his hoofs clink on the cobbles. Then they had not gone. Her uncle was still at Jamaica Inn. Her heart sank, and she wondered if she should return to Richards and the trap and wait, as he had suggested, until Squire Bassett and his men arrived. She glanced once more at the shuttered house. Surely, if her uncle intended to leave, he should have gone before now. The cart alone would take an hour to load, and it must be nearly 11 o'clock. He might have altered his plans and decided to go on foot, but then Aunt Patience would never accompany him. Mary hesitated. The situation had become odd now and unreal. She stood by the porch and listened. She even tried the handle of the door. It was locked, of course. She ventured a little way round the corner of the house, past the entrance to the bar, and so to the patch of garden but beyond the kitchen. She trod softly now, keeping herself in shadow, and she came to where a chink of candlelight would show through a gape in the kitchen shutter. There was no light. She stepped close now to the shutter and laid her eyes against the slit. The kitchen was black as a pit. She laid her hand on the knob of the door and slowly turned it. It gave, to her astonishment, and the door opened. This easy entrance, entirely unforeseen, shocked her for a moment, and she was afraid to enter. Supposing her uncle sat in his chair waiting for her, his gun across his knee. She had her own pistol, but it gave her no confidence. Very slowly, she laid her face to the gap made by the door. No sound came to her. Out of the tail of her eye, she could see the ashes of the fire, but the glow was almost gone. She knew then that nobody was there. Some instinct told her that the kitchen had been empty for hours. She pushed the door wide and went inside. The room struck cold and damp. She waited until her eyes had become accustomed to the darkness, and she could make out the shape of the kitchen table and the chair beside it. There was a candle on the table, and she thrust it into the feeble glow of the fire, where it took light and flickered. Then it burnt strong enough, and she held it high above her head and looked about her. The kitchen was still strewn with preparations for departure. There was a bundle belonging to Aunt Patience on the chair, and a heap of blankets lay on the floor ready to be rolled. In the corner of the room, where it always stood, was her uncle's gun. They had decided, then, to wait another day, and were now abed and asleep in the room upstairs. The door to the passage was wide open, and the silence became more oppressive than before, strangely and horribly still. Something was not as it had been. Some sound was lacking that must account for the silence. Then Mary realized that she could not hear the clock. The ticking had stopped. She stepped into the passage and listened again. She was right. The house was silent because the clock had stopped. She went forward slowly, with the candle in one hand and the pistol leveled in the other. She turned the corner, where the long, dark passage branched into the hall, and she saw that the clock, which stood always against the wall beside the door into the parlor, had toppled forward and fallen upon its face. The glass was splintered in fragments on the stone, and the wood was split. The wall gaped bare where it stood, very naked now and strange, with the paper marked a deep yellow in contrast to the faded pattern of the wall. The clock had fallen across the narrow hall, and it was not until she came to the foot of the stairs that Mary saw what was beyond. The landlord of Jamaica Inn lay on his face amongst the wreckage. The fallen clock had hidden him at first, for he sprawled in the shadow, one arm flung high above his head and the other fastened upon the broken, splintered door. Because his legs were stretched out on either side of him, one foot jamming the wainscoting, he looked even larger in death than he did before, his great frame blocking the entrance from wall to wall. There was blood on the stone floor, and blood between his shoulders, dark now and nearly dry, where the knife had found him. When he was stabbed from behind, he must have stretched out his hand and stumbled, dragging at the clock. And when he fell upon his face, the clock crashed with him to the ground, and he died there, clutching at the door. Okay, Joss Merlin is dead. I feel real bad about the clock. Not so bad about Joss. Chapter 15. It was a long while before Mary moved away from the stairs. Something of her own strength had ebbed away, leaving her powerless like the figure on the floor. Her eyes dwelt upon little immaterial things, the fragments of glass from the smashed clock face that were blood-stained too, and the discolored patch of wall where the clock had stood. A spider settled on her uncle's hand, and it seemed strange to her that the hand lay motionless and did not seek to rid itself of the spider. Her uncle would have shaken it free. Then it crawled from his hand and ran up his arm, working its way beyond the shoulder. When it came to the wound, it hesitated and then made a circuit, returning to it again in curiosity, and there was a lack of fear in its rapidity that was somehow horrible and desecrating to death. The spider knew that the landlord could not harm him. Mary knew this too, but she had not lost her fear like the spider. It was the silence that frightened her most. Now that the clock no longer ticked, her nerves strained for the sound of it. The slow, wheezing choke had been familiar and a symbol of normality. The light of her candle played upon the walls, but did not reach the top of the stairs, where the darkness gaped at her like a gulf. She knew she would never climb those stairs again, now tread that empty landing. Whatever lay beyond her and above must rest there undisturbed. Death had come upon the house tonight, and its brooding spirit still hovered in the air. She felt now this is what Jamaica Inn has always waited for and feared. The damp walls, the creaking boards, the whispers in the air, and the footsteps that had no name. These were the warnings of a house that had felt itself long threatened. Mary shivered. and she knew that the quality of this silence had origin in far-off buried and forgotten things. She dreaded panic above all things. The scream that forced itself to the lips, the wild stumble of groping feet and hands and that beat the air for passage. She was afraid that it might come to her, destroying reason. And now that the first shock of discovery had lessened, she knew that it might force its way upon her, close in and stifle her. Her fingers might lose their sense of grip and touch, and the candle fall from her hands. Then she would be alone and covered by the darkness. The tearing desire to run seized hold of her, and she conquered it. She backed away from the hall towards the passage, the candle flickering in the draught of air, and when she came to the kitchen and saw the door still open to the patch of garden, her calm deserted her, and she ran blindly through the door to the cold, free air outside, a sob in her throat, her outstretched hands grazing the stone wall as she turned the corner of the house. She ran like a thing pursued across the yard and came to the open road, where the familiar stalwart figure of the squire's groom confronted her. He put out his hands to save her, and she groped at his belt, feeling for security, her teeth chattering now in the full shock of reaction. "He's dead," she said. "He's dead there on the floor. I saw him." And try as she did, she could not stop this chattering of her teeth and the shivering of her body. He led her to the side of the road, back to the trap, and he reached for the cloak and put it around her, and she held it to her close, grateful for the warmth. "He's dead," she repeated. "Stabbed in the back. I saw the place where his coat was rent and there was blood. He lay on his face. The clock had fallen with him. The blood was dry, and he looked as though he had lain there for some time. The inn was dark and silent, and no one else was there." "Where's your aunt gone?" whispered the man. Mary shook her head. "I don't know. I did not see. I had to come away." He saw by her face that her strength had gone and she would fall, and he helped her into the trap and climbed onto the seat beside her. "All right, then," he said. "All right. Sit quiet, then. Here. No one shall hurt you. There now. All right, then." His gruff voice helped her, and she crouched beside him in the trap, the warm cloak muffled to her chin. "That was no sight for a maid to see," he told her. "You should have let me go. I wish now you had stayed back here in the trap. That's terrible for you to see him lying there, dead, murdered." Talking eased her, and his rough sympathy was good. "The pony was still in the stable," she said. "I listened to the door and heard him move. They never even finished their preparations for going. The kitchen door was unlocked, and there were bundles on the floor there, blankets too, ready to load into the cart. It must have happened several hours ago." "It puzzles me what the squire is doing," said Richards. "He should have been here before this. I'd feel easier if he'd come and you should tell your story to him. There's been bad work here tonight. You never should have come." They fell silent, and both of them watched the road for the coming of the squire. "Who'd have killed the landlord?" said Richards, puzzled. "He's a match for most men and would have held his own. There was plenty who might have had hand in it, though, for that. If ever a man was hated, he was." Not to interrupt, but I wonder if Aunt Patience did it. Especially if it came from behind. And like she was coming out of her room. Oh my gosh. "There was the peddler," Mary said slowly. "I'd forgotten the peddler. It must have been him, breaking from the barred room." She fastened upon the idea to escape from another, and she retold the story eagerly now of how the peddler had come to the inn the night before. It seemed at once that the crime was proven and there could be no other explanation. "He'll not run far from the squire catches him," said the groom. "You can be sure of that. No one can hide in these moors unless he's a local man, and I have never heard of Harry the Peddler before. But then they come from every hole and corner in Cornwall, Joss Merlin's men, by all accounts. They were, as you might say, the dregs of the country." He paused, and then, "I'll go to the inn if you would care for me to, and see for myself if he has left any trace behind him. There might be something." Mary seized hold of his arm. "I'll not be alone again," she said swiftly. "Think me a coward if you will, but I will not stand it. Had you been inside Jamaica Inn, you would understand. There's a brooding quiet about the place tonight that cares nothing for the poor dead body lying there." "I can mind the time, before your uncle came there, when the house stood empty," said the servant, "and we'd take the dogs there after rats for sport. We thought nothing of it then, just a lonely shell of a place, it seemed, without a soul of its own. But the squire kept it in good repair, mind you, while he waited for a tenant. I'm a St. Neot man myself, and never came here until I served the squire, but I've been told in the old days there was good cheer and company at Jamaica, with friendly, happy folk living in the house, and always a bed for a passing traveller upon the road. The coaches stayed here, there, whatever they do now, and hounds would meet there once a week in Mr. Bassett's boyhood. Maybe these things will come again. Mary shook her head. I've only seen the evil, she said. I've only seen the suffering there's been, and the cruelty and the pain. When my uncle came to Jamaica Inn, he must have cast his shadow over the good things, and they died. Their voices had sunk to a whisper, and they glanced half-consciously over their shoulders to the tall chimneys that stood out against the sky, clear-cut and gray beneath the moon. Both thinking of one thing, and neither had the courage to make it first. The groom from delicacy and tact, Mary from fear alone. Then she spoke, her voice husky and low. Something has happened to my aunt as well. I know that. I know she's dead. That's why I was afraid to go upstairs. She's lying there in the darkness on the landing above. Whatever killed my uncle would have killed her too. The groom cleared his throat. She may have run out into the moor, he said. She may have run for help along the road. No, whispered Mary. She would never have done that. She would be with him now, down in the hall there, crouching by his side. She's dead. I know she's dead. If I had not left her, this would never have happened. The man was silent. He could not help her. After all, she was a stranger to her. After all, she was a stranger to him, and what had passed beneath the roof of the inn while she had lived there was of no concern of his. The responsibility of the evening lay heavy upon his shoulders, and he wished his master would come. Fighting and shouting, he understood. There was sense in that. But if there had really been a murder, as she said, and the landlord lying dead there, and his wife too, they could do no good in staying here like fugitives themselves, crouching in the ditch, but were better off and away, and so down the road to sight and sound of human habitation. I come here by the orders of my mistress, he began awkwardly, but she said the squire would be here. Seeing as he is not, Mary held up a warning hand. Listen, she said sharply. Can you hear something? They strained their ears to the north. The faint clop of horses was unmistakable, coming from beyond the valley, over the brow of the further hill. It's them, said Richards excitedly. It's the squire. He's coming at last. Watch now. We'll see them go down the road into the valley. They waited, and when a minute had passed, the first horseman appeared like a black smudge against the hard white road, followed by another and another. They strung out in a line and closed again, traveling at a gallop, while the cob who waited patiently beside the ditch pricked his ears and turned an inquiring head. The clatter drew near, and Richards in his relief ran out to the road to greet them, shouting and waving his arms. The leader swerved and drew the rein, calling out in surprise in sight of the groom. What the devil do you do here? He shouted, for it was the squire himself, and he held up his hand to warn his followers behind. The landlord's dead. Murdered, cried the groom. I have his niece with me here in the trap. It was Mrs. Bassett herself who sent me out here, sir. This young woman had best tell you the story in her own words. He held the horse while his master dismounted, answering as well as he could the rapid questions put to him by the squire, and the little band of men gathered around him too, pressing for news, some of them dismounting also and stamping their feet on the ground, blowing upon their hands for warmth. If the fellow has been murdered, as you say, then by God it serves him right, said Mr. Bassett. But I'd rather have clapped irons on him myself for all that. Can't play scores against a dead man. Go on into the yard, the rest of you, while I see if I can make sense out of the girl yonder. Richards, relieved of responsibility, was surrounded at once and treated as something of a hero who had not only discovered the murder, but had tackled the author of it single-handedly, until he reluctantly admitted that his part in the adventure had been small. The squire, whose mind worked slowly, did not realize what Mary was doing in the trap and considered her as his groom's prisoner. He heard with astonishment how she had walked the long miles to North Hill in the hopes of finding him, and not content with that, must return again to Jamaica Inn. This is altogether beyond me, he said gruffly. I believe you to be in conspiracy with your uncle against the law. Why did you lie to me then when I came here earlier in the month? You told me you knew nothing. I lied because of my aunt, said Mary wearily. Whatever I said to you then was for her sake only, nor did I know as much as I do then as much as I do now. I'm willing to explain everything in a court of law should it be necessary, but if I tried to tell you now, you would not understand. Nor have I the time to listen, replied the squire. You did a brave thing in walking all the way to North Hill to warn me, and I shall remember it in your favor. But all this trouble could have been avoided, and the terrible crime of Christmas Eve prevented, had you been frank with me before. However, all that for later. My groom tells me that you have found your uncle murdered, but beyond that you know nothing of the crime. Had you been a man, you should go with me now to the inn, but I will spare you that. I can see you have endured enough. He raised his voice and shouted for the servant. Take the trap to the yard and stay beside it with the young woman while we break into the inn. And turning to Mary, I must ask you to wait in the yard if your courage permits you. You are the only one amongst us who knows anything of the matter, and you were the last to see your uncle alive. Mary nodded her head. She was nothing more now than a passive instrument of the law and must do as she was bidden. He at least had spared her the ordeal of going once more into the empty inn and looking upon the body of her uncle. The yard that had lain in shadow when she came was now the scene of activity. Horses stamped on the cobblestones, and there was the shaking, ringing sound of bit and bridle, and there were the footsteps and the voices of the men, topped by the squire Gruff's word of demand. He led the way round to the back, at Mary's direction, and presently the bleak and silent house lost its shuttered air. The window in the bar was flung open, and the windows of the parlor. Some of the men went upstairs and explored the empty guest rooms above, for these windows were unbarred also and open to the air. Only the heavy entrance door remained shut, and Mary knew that the landlord's body lay stretched across the threshold. Someone called sharply from the house and was answered by a murmur of voices and a question from the squire. The sounds came plainly now through the open parlor window to the yard outside. Richards glanced across at Mary, and he saw by the pallor of her face that she had heard. A man who stood by the horses and who had not gone with the others inside shouted to the groom. Do you hear what they say? He said in some excitement. There's another body there. On the landing, upstairs. Richard said nothing. Mary drew her cloak further around her shoulders and pulled the hood across her face. They waited in silence. Presently, the squire himself came out to the yard and crossed to the trap. I am sorry, he said. I have bad news for you. Perhaps you expected it. Yes, said Mary. I don't think she suffered at all. She must have died at once. She was lying just inside the bedroom at the end of the passage, stabbed like your uncle. She could have known nothing. Believe me, I am very sorry. I wish I could have spared you this. He stood by her, awkward and distressed, and repeated again that she could not have suffered, that she had not known, but was killed instantly. And then, seeing that Mary were better left alone, and he could not help her, he stamped back across the yard to the inn. Mary sat motionless, shrouded in her cloak, and she prayed in her own way that Aunt Patience would forgive her and find peace now wherever she should be, and that the dragging chains of life would fall away from her, leaving her free. She prayed also that Aunt Patience would understand what she had tried to do, and above all that her mother would be there and she would not be alone. I'm trying hard not to cry. I mean, Aunt Patience was the strongest character, but, Mary loved her. These were the only thoughts that brought her a measure of consolation, and she knew that if she went over in her mind again the story of the last few hours, she would come to the one and only accusation. Had she not left Jamaica Inn, Aunt Patience might not have died. Once again, though, there came a murmur of excitement from the house, and this time there was shouting and the sound of running feet, and several voices raised in unison, so that Richards ran to the open parlor window, forgetting his trust in the excitement of the moment, and thrust his leg over the sill. There was a crash of splintering wood, and the shutters were torn away from the window of the barred room, which no one, apparently, had entered up to now. The men were tearing away at the barricade of wood, and someone held a fire to the light. Mary could see the flame dance in the draught of air. Then the light vanished, and the voices died away, and she could hear the sound of footsteps tramping to the back of the house, and then round the corner to the yard they came, 6 or 7 of them, led by the squire, holding amongst them something that squirmed and wriggled and fought for release with hoarse, bewildered cries. They've got him! It's the murderer! Shouted Richards, calling to Mary, and she turned, brushing aside the hood that covered her face, and looked down upon the group of men who came to the trap. The captive stared up at her, blinking at the lights they flashed in his eyes, his clothes cobweb-covered, his face unshaven and black. And it was Harry, the peddler. Who is he? They shouted. Do you know him? and the squire came round in front of the trap and bade them bring the man close so that she could see him. "What do you know about this fellow?" he said to Mary. "We found him in the barred room yonder, lying on some sacks, and he denies all knowledge of the company. He denies all knowledge of the crime." "He was of the company," said Mary slowly, "and he came to the inn last night and quarrelled with my uncle. My uncle had the better of him and locked him in the barred room, threatening him with death. He had every reason to kill my uncle, and no one could have done it but he. He is lying to you." "But the door was locked upon him. It took 3 of us or more to break it down from the outside," said the squire. "This fellow had never been from the room at all. Look at his clothes. Look at his eyes, dazzled still by the light. He is not your murderer." The peddler glanced furtively from one to the other of his guards, his small, mean eyes darting from right to left, and Mary knew at once that what the squire had said was no more than the truth. Harry the peddler could not have committed this crime. He had lain in the barred room since the landlord put him there over 24 hours ago. He had lain there in the dark, waiting for release, and during the long hours someone had come to Jamaica Inn and gone again, his work completed in the silence of the night. "Whoever did it knew nothing of this rascal, locked in the room yonder," continued the squire, "and he's no use to us as a witness, as far as I can see, for he heard and saw nothing. But we'll have him in jail for all that, and hang him, too, if he deserves it, which I'll be bound he does. But he shall turn king's evidence first and give us the names of his companions. One of them has killed the landlord for revenge, you may depend on that, and we'll track him down if we set every hound in Cornwall on his heels. Take this to the fellow in the stable. Take this fellow to the stable, some of you, and hold him there. The rest come back to the inn with me." They dragged the peddler away, who, realizing that some crime had been discovered and suspicion might possibly rest upon him, found his tongue at last and began to babble his innocence, whining for mercy and swearing by the Trinity until someone cuffed him to silence and threatened him with a rope there and then above the stable door. This silenced him, and he fell to muttering blasphemies beneath his breath, turning his rat's eyes now and again to Mary, who sat above him in the trap a few yards away. She waited there, her chin in her hand, and the hood fallen away from her face, and she neither heard his blasphemies nor saw his furtive, narrow eyes, for she remembered other eyes that had looked upon her in the morning, and another voice that had spoken calm and cold, saying of his brother, "He shall die for this." There was the sentence, flung carelessly on the way to Launceston Fair. "I've never killed a man yet." And there was the gypsy woman in the market square. "There's blood on your hands. You'll kill a man one day." All the little things she would forget rose up again and clamored against him. His hatred of his brother, his streak of callous cruelty, his lack of tenderness, his tainted Merlin blood. That, before all things, would betray him first. Like to like, one of a kind. He had gone to Jamaica Inn as he had promised, and his brother had died as he had sworn. The whole truth stared up at her in ugliness and horror, and she wished now that she had stayed and he had killed her too. He was a thief, and like a thief in the night, he had come and was gone again. She knew that the evidence could be built against him piece by piece, with herself as witness. It would be a fence around him from which there would be no escape. She had only to go to the squire and say, "I know who it is who has done this thing," and they would listen to her, all of them. They would crawl around her like a pack of hounds panting for the chase, and the trail would lead them to him, past Rushford and through Treywall Marsh to 12 Men's Moor. He slept there now, perhaps, forgetful of his crime and caring not at all, stretched on his bed in the lonely cottage where he and his brother had been born. When morning came, he would be gone, whistling perhaps, throwing his legs across a horse and go away and out of Cornwall forever, a murderer like his father before him. In her fancy, she heard the clop of his horse upon the road, far distant in the quiet night, beating a tempo of farewell. But fancy became reason, and reason became certainty, and the sound she heard was not the dream thing of her imagination, but the live tapping of a horse upon the highway. She turned her head and listened, nerves strung now to the limit, and the hands that held the cloak around her were clammy and cold with sweat. The sound of the horse drew nearer still. He was trotting at a steady, even pace, neither hurried nor slow, and the rhythmic jogging tune that he played on the road had echo in her throbbing heart. She was not alone now as she listened. The men who guarded the peddler murmured to one another in low tones and looked towards the road, and the grooms Richard, who stood with them, hesitated a moment, and then went swiftly to the inn to call the squire. The beat of the horse's hoofs rang loud now as he climbed the hill, sounding like a challenge to the night, so silent and still, and he topped the summit and rounded the wall into the view. The squire came out of the inn, followed by his man. "Stop," he called. "In the name of the king, I must ask your business on the road tonight." The horseman drew rein and turned to the yard. The black riding cape gave no clue to his identity, but when he bowed and bared his head, the thick halo of hair shone white under the moon, and the voice that spoke in answer to the squire was gentle and sweet. "Mr. Bassett of North Hills, I believe," he said, and he leant forward in his saddle with a note in his hand. "I have a message here from Mary Yellan of Jamaica Inn, who asks my help in trouble. But I see by the company assembled here that I have come too late. You remember me, of course. We have met before. I am the vicar of Alternon." Ah, the vicar. Man, oh man. Chapter 16. Mary sat alone in the living room at the vicarage and watched the smoldering turf fire. She had slept long and was now rested and refreshed, but the peace for which she craved had not yet come to her. They had been kind to her and patient, too kind perhaps, coming so sudden and unexpected after the long strain. And Mr. Bassett himself, with clumsy, well-meaning hands, patted her on the shoulder as he would a hurt child and said to her in his gruff, kind way, "Now you must sleep and forget all you've gone through, and remember it's behind you now and over. I can promise you that we shall find the man who killed your aunt soon, very soon, and he shall hang in the next Aussies. And when you are a little recovered from the shock of these last few months, you shall say what you would like to do, and where you would like to go." She had no will of her own. They could make decisions for her. And when Francis Davy offered his home for shelter, she accepted meekly and without feeling, conscious that her listless word of thanks savored of ingratitude. Once more, she knew the humility of being born a woman, when the breaking down of strength and spirit was taken as natural and unquestioned. Were she a man now, she would have received rough treatment, or indifference at the best, and be requested to ride at once, perhaps to Baden or to Launceston, to bear witness, with an understanding that she should find her own lodging and betake herself to the world's end if she wished, with all the questions had been asked. And she would depart when they had finished with her and go on a ship somewhere, working her passage before the mast, or tramp the road with one silver penny in her pocket and her heart and soul at liberty. Here she was, with tears ready to the surface and an aching head, being hurried from the scene of action with smooth words and gestures, a nuisance and a factor of delay, like every woman and every child after tragedy. The vicar had driven her himself in the trap, with the squire's groom following behind on his horse, and he at least had the gift of silence, for he questioned her not at all, nor murmured sympathy to be both wasted and ignored, but drove swiftly to Alternon, and arrived there as his church clock struck 1. He roused his housekeeper from the cottage near by, the same woman that Mary had spoken with in the afternoon, and bade her come with him to the vicarage to prepare a room for his guest, which she did at once, without chattering or exclaiming in wonder, bringing the aired linen from her own home to lay on the bed. She kindled a fire in the grate, and warmed a rough woolen nightdress before it, while Mary shed her clothes, and when the bed was ready for her and the smooth sheets turned back, Mary allowed herself to be led to it as a child is led to a cradle. She would have closed her eyes at once, but for an arm suddenly around her shoulders and a voice in her ear. "Drink this," pervasive and cool, and Francis Davy himself stood beside the bed with a glass in his hand and his strange eyes looking at hers, pale and expressionless. "You will sleep now," he said, and she knew from the bitter taste that he had put some powder in the hot drink which he had brewed for her, and that he had done this in understanding of her restless, tortured mind. The last that she remembered was his hand upon her forehead and those still white eyes that told her to forget, and then she slept as he had bidden her. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon before she woke, and the 14 hours of sleep had done the work that he intended, turning the edge of sorrow and blunting her to pain. The sharp grief for Aunt Patience had softened, and the bitterness too. Reason told her that she should not put the blame upon herself, She had done only what her conscience had commanded her to do. Justice had come first. Her dull wit had not foreseen the tragedy. There lay the fault. There remained regret, and regret could not bring Aunt Patience back again. These were her thoughts on rising, but when she was dressed and had gone below to the living room to find the fire burning and the curtains drawn, and the vicar abroad upon some business, the old nagging sense of insecurity returned to her, and it seemed to her that responsibility for the disaster lay on her shoulders alone. Jem's face was ever present with her as she had seen it last, drawn and haggard in the false gray light, and there had been a purpose in his eyes then, and in the very set of his mouth, that she had willfully ignored. He had been the unknown factor from the beginning to the end, from the first morning when he had come to the bar in Jamaica Inn, and deliberately she had shut her eyes to the truth. She was a woman, and for no reason in heaven or earth she had loved him. He had kissed her, and she was bound to him forever. She felt herself fallen and degraded, weakened in mind and body, who had been strong before, and her pride had gone with her independence. One word to the vicar when he returned, and a message to the squire, and Aunt Patience would be avenged. Jem would die with a rope around his neck as his father has done, and she would return to Helford, seeking the threads of her old life that lay twisted even now and buried in the soil. She got up from the chair beside the fire and began to walk the length of the room, with some idea that she was wrestling now with her ultimate problem. But even as she did so, she knew that her very action was a lie, a poor trick to appease her conscience, and that the word would never be given. Jem was safe from her. And he would ride away with a song on his lips and a laugh at her expense, forgetful of her and of his brother and of God, while she dragged through the years, sullen and bitter, the stain of silence marking her, coming in the end to ridicule as a soured spinster who had been kissed once in her life and could not forget it. Cynicism and sentimentality were two extremes to be avoided, and as Mary prowled about the room, her mind was as restless as her body. She felt as though Francis Davy himself were watching her, his cold eyes probing her soul. The room held something of him after all, now that he was not here, and she could imagine him standing in the corner by the easel, his brush in his hand, staring out of the window at things that were dead and gone. There were canvases with their faces to the wall close to the easel, and Mary turned them to the light and curiosity. Here was an interior of a church, his church, she supposed. Painted in the twilight of midsummer, it would seem, with a nave in shadow. There was a strange green afterflow upon the arches, stretching up to the roof, and this light was something sudden and unexpected that lingered in her memory after she had laid the picture aside, so that she returned to it and considered it once more. It might be that this green afterglow was a faithful reproduction and peculiar to his church at Alternan, but for all that, it cast a haunting and uncanny light upon the picture, and Mary knew that she had home, she would not care for and Mary knew that had she a home, she would not care for it to hang upon her walls. She could not have put her feeling of discomfort into words, but it was as though some spirit, having no knowledge of the church itself, had groped its way to the interior and breathed an alien atmosphere upon the shadowed nave. As she turned to the paintings, one by one, she saw that they were all tainted in the same manner and to the same degree. What might have been a striking study of the moor beneath Brown Willie on a spring day, with the high clouds banked up behind the tor, had been marred by the dark color and the very contour of the clouds that dwarfed the picture and overwhelmed the scene, with the same green light predominating all. She wondered for the first time whether by being born albino and a freak of nature, his color sense was therefore in any way impaired, and his sight itself neither normal nor true. This might be the explanation, but even so, her feelings of discomfort remained after she had replaced the canvases with their faces to the wall. She continued her inspection of the room, which told her little, it being sparsely furnished anyway, and free of ornaments and books. Even his desk was bare of correspondence and looked seldom used. She drummed with her fingers on the polished surface, wondering if he sat there to write his sermons, and suddenly and unpardonably she opened the narrow drawer beneath the desk. It was empty, and at once she was ashamed. She was about to shut it when she noticed that the paper with which the drawer was laid had one corner turned, and there was some sketch drawn upon the other side. She took hold of the paper and glanced at the drawing. Once again, it represented the interior of a church, but this time the congregation was assembled in the pews and the vicar himself at the pulpit. At first, Mary saw nothing unusual in the sketch. It was a subject natural enough for a vicar to choose who had skill with his pen. But when she looked closer, she realized what he had done. This was not a drawing at all, but a caricature, grotesque as it was horrible. The people of the congregation were bonneted and shawled and in their best clothes as for Sunday, but he had drawn sheep's heads upon their shoulders instead of human faces. The animal jaws gaped foolishly at the preacher with silly, vacant solemnity, and their hoofs were folded in prayer. The features of each sheep had been touched upon with care, as though representing a living soul, but the expression on every one of them was the same, that of an idiot who neither knew nor cared. The preacher, with his black gown and halo of hair, was Francis Davy, but he had given himself a wolf's face, and the wolf was laughing at the flock beneath him. The thing was Montgomery, blasphemous and terrible. Mary covered it quickly and replaced the paper in the drawer with a white sheet uppermost. Then she shut the drawer and went away from the desk and sat once more in the chair beside the fire. She had stumbled upon a secret, and she would rather that secret stayed concealed. This was something that concerned her not at all, but rested between the draughtsman and his God. When she heard his footsteps on the path outside, she rose hurriedly and moved the light away from her chair so that she would be in shadow when he came in the room, and he could not read her face. Her chair had its back to the door, and she sat there, waiting for him. But he was so long in coming that she turned at last to listen for his steps, and then she saw him, standing behind her chair, having entered the room noiselessly from the hall. She started in surprise, and he came forward there into the light, making apology for his appearance. "Forgive me," he said. "You did not expect me so soon, and I have blundered into your dreams." She shook her head and stammered an excuse. Then he asked at once after her health and how she had slept, stripping himself of the greatcoat as he spoke and standing before the fire in his black clerical dress. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. And when she told him he had not, he took out his watch and noted the time, a few minutes before 6, which he compared with the clock upon his desk. "You have supped with me before, Mary Yellan, and you shall sup with me again," he said. "But this time, if you do not mind, and if you are rested enough, you shall lay the table and fetch the tray from the kitchen. Hannah will have left it prepared, and we will not trouble her again. For my part, I have writing to do. That is, if you have no objection." She assured him that she was rested and would like nothing better than to make herself useful, and he nodded his head and said, "At 6:45, turning his back on her, and she gathered that she was dismissed. She made her way to the kitchen, put something out of the countenance of his abrupt arrival, and she was glad that he had given her an added half-hour to herself, for she had been ill prepared for conversation when he found her. Perhaps supper would be a brief affair, and once over, he would turn to his desk again and leave her to her thoughts. She wished she had not opened the drawer. The memory of the caricature lingered with her unpleasantly. She felt much as a child does who acquires knowledge forbidden by his parents and then hangs his head, guilty and ashamed, fearful that his tongue will betray him. She would have been more comfortable could she have just taken her meal alone here in the kitchen and been treated by him as a handmaid rather than a guest. As it was, her position was not defined for his courtesy, and his commands were curiously mingled. She made play, then, of getting the supper, at home amongst the familiar kitchen smells, and awaited reluctantly the summons of the clock. The church itself chimed the 3/4 and gave her no excuse, so she carried the tray to the living room, hoping that nothing of her inner feelings showed upon her face. He was standing with his back to the fire, and he had pulled the table in readiness before it. Although she did not look at him, she felt his scrutiny upon her, and her movements were clumsy. She was aware, too, that he had made some alteration to the room, and out of the tail of her eye she saw that he had taken down his easel, and the canvases were no longer stacked against the wall. The desk, for the first time, was in disorder, with papers and correspondence piled upon it, and he had been burning letters, too, for the yellow, Blackened scraps lay amongst the ashes under the turf. They sat down together at the table, and he helped her to the cold pie. "Is curiosity dead in Mary Yellan that she does not ask me what I have done with my day?" he said at length, mocking her gently and bringing the flush of guilt to her face at once. "It is no business of mine where you have been," she answered. "You are wrong there," he said, "and it is your business. I have meddled in your affairs the lifelong today. You asked for my help, did you not?" Mary was ashamed and hardly knew what to say. "I have not thanked you yet for coming so promptly to Jamaica Inn," she said, "nor for my bed last night and my sleep today. You think me ungrateful." "I never said that. I wondered only at your patience. It had not struck 2 when I bade you sleep this morning, and it is now 7 in the evening. Long hours, and things do not stand still by themselves." "Did you not sleep then, after you left me?" "I slept until 8, and then I breakfasted and was away again. My gray horse was lame, and I could not use him, so progress was slow with the cob. He jogged like a snail to Jamaica Inn, and from Jamaica Inn to North Hill." "You've been to North Hill?" "Mr. Bassett entertained me to luncheon. There were 8 or 10 of us present, I dare say, and each one of us shouting his opinion to the deaf ear of his neighbor. It was a lengthy meal, and I was glad when the end came of it. However, we were all of one accord that the murder of your uncle will not remain at liberty for long." "Does Mr. Bassett suspect anyone?" Mary's tone was guarded, and she kept her eyes on her plate. The food tasted like sawdust in her mouth. "Mr. Bassett is ready to suspect himself. He has questioned every inhabitant within a radius of 10 miles, and the number of strange persons who were abroad last night is legion. It will take a week or more to have the truth from every one of them, but no matter, Mr. Bassett is not deterred." "What have they done with my aunt?" "They were both taken, both of them, to North Hill this morning and are to be buried there. All that has been arranged, and you need not concern yourself. As for the rest, well, we shall see." "And the peddler? They have not let him go?" "No. He is safe under lock and key, screaming curses to the air." Excuse me. "I do not care for the peddler. Neither, I think, do you." Mary laid beside the fork she had lifted to her lips and put down the meat again, untasted. "How do you mean?" she said, on the defensive. "I repeat, you do not care for the peddler. I can well understand it, for a more unpleasant and disagreeable fellow I have never clapped eyes on. I gather from Richards, groom to Mr. Bassett, that you suspected the peddler of the murder and said as much to Mr. Bassett himself. Hence my conclusion that you do not care for him. It is a pity for all of us that the barred room proves him innocent. He would have made an excellent scapegoat and saved a deal of trouble." The vicar continued to make an excellent supper, but Mary was only playing with her food, and when he offered her second helping, she refused. "What has the peddler done to incur your displeasure to such an extent?" he inquired, harping upon the subject with persistence. "He attacked me once." "I thought as much. He is true to a particular type. You resisted him, of course." "I believe I hurt him. He did not touch me again." "No, I don't suppose he did. When did this happen?" "On Christmas Eve." "After I left you at 5 Lanes?" "Yes." "I am beginning to understand. You did not return, then, to the inn that night? You fell in with the landlord and his friends upon the road?" "Yes." "And they took you with them to the shore to add to their sport?" "Please, Mr. Davy, do not ask me any more. I'd rather not speak of that night, neither here nor in the future, nor ever again. There are some things that are best buried deep." "You shall not speak of it, Mary Yellan. I blame myself for having allowed you to continue your journey alone. Looking at you now, with your clear eye and skin and the way you carry your head, and above all the set of your chin, you bear little trace of what you endured. The word of a parish priest may not go for much, but you have shown remarkable fortitude. I admire you." Mary looked up at him and then away again, and fell to crumbling a piece of bread in her hand. "When I consider the peddler," he continued after a while, helping himself generously to stewed damsons, I feel it very remiss of the murderer not to have looked into the barred room. May have been that he was pressed for time, but a minute or two could hardly have affected the issue, and he would most certainly have made the whole affair more thorough. In what way, Mr. Davy? Why, by putting paid to the peddler's account. You mean he might have killed him too? Precisely. The peddler is no ornament to the world while he lives, and dead he would at least make food for worms. That is my opinion. What is more, had the murderer known what the peddler had attacked you, he would have had a motive strong enough to kill twice over. Mary cut herself a slice of cake she did not want and forced it between her lips. By making a pretense of eating, she gave herself countenance. The hand shook, though, that held the knife, and she made a poor job of her slice. I don't see what I have to do in the matter, she said. You have too modest an opinion of yourself, he replied. They continued to eat in silence, Mary with lowered head and eyes firm fixed upon her plate. Instinct told her that he played with her as an angler plays with a fish upon his line. At last she could wait no longer, but must spurt him a question. So Mr. Bassett and the rest of you have made little headway, after all, and the murderer is still at large? Catherine, yes, it is a strange conversation, which makes me ask two questions. One, did he do it? And two, does he know or think that Jem did it? Yeah, the vicar knows more than he's letting on, definitely. Plus, a vicar just said someone might be better off dead. That's not really in line with their world. Oh, well, we have not moved as slowly as that. Some progress has been made. The peddler, for instance, in a hopeless attempt to save his own skin, has turned King's evidence to the best of his ability, but he has not helped us much. We have had from him a bald account of the work done on the coast on Christmas Eve, in which he says he took no part, and also some patching together of the long months that have gone before. We heard of the wagons that came to Jamaica Inn by night, among other things, and we were given the names of his companions, those he knew, that is to say. The organization appears to have been far larger than was hitherto supposed. Mary said nothing. She shook her head when he offered her the damsons. In fact, continued the vicar, he went so far as to suggest that the landlord of Jamaica Inn was their leader in name only, and that your uncle had his orders from one above him. That, of course, puts a new complexion on the matter. The gentleman became excited and a little disturbed. What have you to say of the peddler's theory? It's possible, of course. I believe you once made the same suggestion to me. I may have done, I forget. If this is so, it would seem that the unknown leader and the murderer must be one and the same person. Don't you agree? Why, yes, I suppose so. That should narrow the field considerably. We may disregard the general rabble of the company and look for someone with a brain and a personality. Did you ever see such a person at Jamaica Inn? No, never. He might have gone to and fro in stealth, possibly in the silence of the night when you and your aunt were abed and asleep. He would not have come across the high road because you would have heard the clatter of his horse's hooves. But there's always the possibility that he came on foot, is there not? Yes, there is always that possibility, as you say. In which case, the man must know the moors, or at least have local knowledge. One of the gentlemen suggested that he lived nearby, within walking or riding distance, that is to say, and that is why Mr. Bassett intends to question every inhabitant of the radius of 10 miles, as I explained to you at the beginning of supper. So you see, the net will close around the murderer, and if he tarries long, he will be caught. We are all convinced of that. Have you finished already? You haven't eaten. You have eaten very little. I'm not hungry. I am sorry for that. Hannah will think her cold pie was not appreciated. Did I tell you I saw an acquaintance of yours today? No, you did not. I have no friends but yourself. Thank you, Mary Yellan. That is a pretty compliment, and I shall treasure it accordingly. But you are not being strictly truthful, you know. You have an acquaintance. You told me so yourself. I don't know who you mean, Mr. Davy. Come now. Did not the landlord's brother take you to the Launceston Fair? Mary gripped her hands under the table and dug her nails into her flesh. The landlord's brother? She repeated, playing for time. I have not seen him since then. I believed him to be away. No, he has been in the district since Christmas. He told me so himself. As a matter of fact, it had come to his ears that I had given you shelter, and he came up to me with a message for you. Tell her how sorry I am. That is what he said. I presume he referred to your aunt. Was that all he said? I believe he would have said more, but Mr. Bassett interrupted us. Mr. Bassett? Mr. Bassett was there when he spoke to you? Why, of course. There were several of the gentlemen in the room. It was just before I came away from North Hills this evening, when the discussion was closed for the day. Why was Jem Merlin present at the discussion? He had a right, I suppose, as brother of the deceased. He did not appear much moved by his loss, but perhaps they did not agree. Did Mr. Bassett and the gentleman question him? There was considerable amount of talk amongst them the whole day. Young Merlin appears to possess intelligence. His answers were most astute. He must have a far better brain than his brother ever had. You told me he lived somewhere precariously, I believe. He stole horses, I remember. Mary nodded. Her fingers traced a pattern on the tablecloth. He seems to have done that when there was nothing better to do, said the vicar. But when a chance came for him to use his intelligence, he took it, and small blame to him, I suppose. No doubt he was well paid. The gentle voice wore away at her nerves, pinpricking them with every word. She knew now that he had defeated her, and she could no longer keep up the pretense of indifference. She lifted up her face to him, her eyes heavy with the agony of restraint, and she spread out her hands in supplication. What will they do to him, Mr. Davy? She said. What will they do to him? The pale, expressionless eyes stared back at her, and for the first time she saw a shadow pass across them and a flicker of surprise. Do? He said, obviously puzzled. Why should they do anything? I suppose he has made his peace with Mr. Bassett and has nothing more to fear. They will thoroughly throw his old sins in his face after the service he has done them. I don't understand you. What service has he done? Your mind worked slowly tonight, Mary Yellan, and I appear to talk in riddles. Did you not know that it was Jem Merlin who informed against his brother? She stared at him stupidly, her brains clogged and refusing to work. She repeated the word after him like a child who learns a lesson. Jem Merlin informed against his brother? The vicar pushed away his plate and began to set things in order on the tray. Why, certainly, he said, so Mr. Bassett gave me to understand. It appears that it was the squire himself who fell in with your friend at Launceston on Christmas Eve and carried him off to North Hill as an experiment. You've stolen my horse, said he, and you're as big as a rogue as your brother. I have the power to clap you in jail tomorrow, and you wouldn't set eyes on a horse for a dozen years or more. But you can go free if you bring me proof that your brother at Jamaica Inn is the man I believe him to be. Your young friend asked for time, and when the time was up, he shook his head. No, he said, you must catch him yourself if you want him. I'm damned if I'll have truck with the law. But the squire pushed a proclamation under his nose. Look there, Jem, he said, and see what you think of that. There's been the bloodiest wreck on Christmas Eve since the Lady of Gloucester went ashore above Padstow last winter. Now will you change your mind? As to the rest of the story, the squire said little in my hearing. People were coming and going all the time, you must remember. But I gather your friend slipped his chain and ran for it in the night, and then came back again yesterday morning when they thought to have been the last of him, and went straight to the squire as he came out of church and said, cool as you please, very well, Mr. Bassett, you shall have your proof. And that is why I remarked to you just now that Jem Merlin had a better brain than his brother. The vicar had cleared the table and set tray in the corner, but he continued to stretch his legs before the fire and take his ease in the narrow, high-backed chair. Mary took no account of his movements. She stared before her into space, her whole mind split, as it were, by his information, The evidence she had so fearfully and so painfully built against the man she loved, collapsing into nothing like a pack of cards. Mr. Davy, she said slowly, I believe I am the biggest fool that ever came out of Cornwall. I believe you are, Mary Yellan, said the vicar. His dry tone, so cutting after the gentle voice she knew, was a rebuke in itself, and she accepted it with humility. Whatever happens, she continued, I can face the future now, bravely and without shame. I am glad of that. She shook her hair back from her face and smiled for the first time since he had known her. The anxiety and the dread had gone from her at last. What else did Jem Merlin say and do? She asked. The vicar glanced at his watch and replaced it with a sigh. I wish I had the time to tell you, but it is nearly 8 already. The hours go by too fast for both of us. I think we have talked enough about Jem Merlin for the present. To tell me one thing, was he at North Hill when you left? He was. In fact, it was his last remark that hurried me home. What did he say to you? He did not address himself to me. He announced his intention of riding over tonight to visit the blacksmith at Warligan. Mr. Davy, you are playing with me now. I most certainly am not. Warligan is a long trek from North Hill, but I dare say he can find his way in the dark. What has it to do with you if he visits the blacksmith? He will show the nail he picked up on the heather down on the field below Jamaica Inn. The nail comes from a horse's shoe. The job was carelessly done, of course. The nail was a new one, and Jem Merlin, being a stealer of horses, knows the work of every blacksmith on the moors. Look here, he said to the squire, I found this morning in the field behind the inn. Now you have your discussions and want me no more. I'll ride to Warligan with your leave and throw this in Tom Jory's face as bad workmanship. Well, and what then? Yesterday was Sunday, was it not? And on Sunday, no blacksmith plies his trade unless he has great respect for his customer. Only one passed Tom Jory's smithy yesterday and begged for a new nail for his lame horse, and the time was, I suppose, somewhere near 7 o'clock in the evening, after which the traveller continued his journey by way of Jamaica Inn. How do you know this? Said Mary. Because the traveller was the vicar of Altrincham, he said. We're out of time, but oh my gosh, I have to wait 5 more days. But I'm with you. I will not read ahead. I am just as gobsmacked as the rest of us about how this is turning out. It's amazing. Okay, so we'll start on chapter 17 next time, page 313. Oh my gosh, this book. Yeah, I think the vicar did it. And now, if the vicar is going to tell Mary what's going to happen. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. I know, Catherine, I'm with you. I need to have a glass of water and step away from this book for a little bit. Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you. One more. We will finish it up. We got this little bit left to go. And we will finish it up next time we see each other. Until then, have a fantastic day. Stay safe, drink lots of water, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.